What is the one principal cause of polarization? Societal polarization. One cause. What is it? Well, there was a guy called Peter Coleman. He's a social psychologist, and he did a review of the literature on entrenched conflicts, really deep, long-lasting conflicts like Israel-Palestine. And he found that there were all these different authors who were each saying, I've found the one principal cause of this situation. And when he added them all up in this intense literature review, there were 57 principal causes. And I think that that is really a reflection of the way that our world actually works. So it's not that any of those was wrong, it's that the thought that there can be just one cause for something is a gross oversimplification of the complexity there. But what we are seeing right now is what the Pew Research Center in the US has called the rising tide of mutual antipathy. And I think that that's rising in a lot of places, and I think that some of the rhetoric in the recent election suggests that it's an issue here in Canada as well. So I started looking into all these questions, and you're not supposed to be able to read what's on this slide. I just wanted to put it as a visualization of the fact that there are a lot of interrelated issues, and the book is covering a whole bunch of them. So, but I was really fascinated to look into a lot of questions like, how much do people really change? Does contact between groups help to reduce prejudices? Why do people believe strange and implausible things? What works and what doesn't in getting children to learn to respect rules? How do we learn if we don't want to have a destructive conflict, but the other side wants to have a destructive conflict and has a position of power? What can we do? And how do we deal with really difficult people? What's going on with polarization? And I know that all of us are on the same page, so all of our minds went to Framingham, Massachusetts. Am I right? We were all thinking it. It's a small town of 67,000 people. And since 1948, researchers have been going there and collecting data from thousands of residents of Framingham. And in 2008, a team decided that it was time to look into this piles and piles of data. So they looked at the health, emotional well-being, and social networks of 4,739 residents of the town. Exploring who each person was connected with year after year over a 30-year period led to a really remarkable discovery. So here's you. And this is your friend. It turns out that if your friend becomes happier, you also become happier. Then they saw that if a friend of your friend becomes happier, you also get happier. And amazingly, if a friend of your friend, someone that you're likely to have never even met, becomes happier, that significantly increases your happiness. It's a small impact, but it's there. So what this research was showing was that the same individuals were having changed emotional well-being and happiness levels based on networks. So this was not happy people going out and finding other happy people and being friends with them. This was happiness spreading between people. It was like a virus. Now, of course, it's not only happiness that spreads that way. So in a different study, researchers looked at college dorm rooms, and they found that when people were coming into these dorm rooms, some of them were bringing pessimistic thought patterns. And that pessimism was leading to certain forms of depression, and that depression was lingering in the dorm rooms even after those students graduated, because they had passed it on to the next generation of students coming in. The researchers said that it was like a lingering flu. There's all kinds of research on this really fascinating topic of network science, and it's finding that our decisions like drinking, smoking, whether or not to become an organ donor, buying a house, our levels of aggression can spread within our social networks. So this means two really fascinating things. It means that you have a lot of power to influence people who you've never even met. And it means that you're quite vulnerable to an influence coming from people who you will never meet. A major study on Facebook users found that rainfall directly influences the emotional content of their status messages. So that it means that their friends as well in cities who are not experiencing rainfall also show more pessimistic messages. In other words, the researchers said social media may magnify the intensity of global emotional synchrony. Now, of course, it's not really global because who do we synchronize with? The decisions of a few companies are impacting the information that most of the world accesses today. And that is actually staggering. They make money from your attention and from your data. They've designed their platforms to keep you on them as long as possible. And one way to do that is to present you with what they think you want to hear based on a profile that they have about you. And that's a filter bubble. It means that you're systematically fed information that seems to show you that the world is as you imagine it and want it to be. And we really like being in bubbles. This was an issue before Facebook. We actually try to put ourselves in them. Neuroscientists have found that getting the information we want to hear is actually pleasurable, and that being challenged is anything but. So we're biased toward looking for information that confirms what we want to believe. Chapters 6 and 7 of the book delve into those questions in more depth, but consider this. When we say we know something, what do we mean? Almost always, we mean that we trust someone else who's come up with that fact or that idea. Not that we're speaking from personal, detailed research. So what's being undermined heavily right now in the digital moment is collective trust. So we're forming trust with smaller groups of people, and a lot of that is based on our identities. And that's a formula for polarization. And of course, I also want to add that digital communication has many, many positive aspects as well, and we can learn and access information in ways we never could before, and build community with people. So it's not just a simple negative. But some of us are probably thinking at this point, well, none of this surprises me. But if you stop to think about it further, much of what I just said goes against some really fundamental beliefs that we have about ourselves. That we're our own individuals. That we make generally well-informed choices. That the happiness of the friends of our friends has nothing to do with us. Current research is breaking down the idea of an isolated, static individual consistently making reasonable choices. Instead, more and more of what scientists are learning shows us our interdependence and our malleability. Many of our ideas about ourselves can be a bit pessimistic, a little bit fatalistic, and really certain that brutality is just natural and unavoidable, and you can't teach an old dog new tricks. So how many of you think that a single brief workshop telling kids factual information could improve their grades and their outlooks on life a whole year later? What do you think the study was showing these kids? What do you think the single brief training taught them?
Self-esteem.
Self-esteem, very important. Yeah. It actually talked to them about the research that their personality isn't set in stone, that who they are today isn't who they're going to be for the rest of their life exactly. This left them feeling calmer under pressure, more able to deal with insults from their peers, and yes, it did improve their grades a full year later. That was compared to a group who was taught strategies for coping with stress. When we think people can't change, then anything bad someone does is just who they are as a person. And that mentality leads us to not want to work with that person and to write them off, and it leads us to deny when we've made a mistake. This one was really surprising to me. So there was a meta-analysis, a study of studies, of 207 studies, and it found that people's personality traits like our emotional stability, our agreeableness, conscientiousness, even our degree of extroversion can change with cognitive behavioral therapies in the matter of months, not years. And this is a study on adults. So the point is Geneticists have in recent years come to understand that environmental and social factors have huge impacts on our genes, how they're expressed. Our DNA is not a specific predefined destiny, and people are continually changing. Neuroscience is finding out more and more about how use changes the brain. As many of us have heard over enough repetitions, neurons that fire together in time will physically wire together. And the opposite is also true. So neurons we don't use get pruned away and connections break down, fire apart, wire apart, as new connections form. So as neuroscientist Rick Hansen explains, what flows through your mind sculpts your brain. Immaterial experience leaves material traces behind. This is really fascinating. It means that there's a lot more plasticity, a lot more change happening within us than we had ever thought, the neuroscientists in particular had thought for many, many decades. So it used to be thought that basically once you reach about 25, your brain is just maintaining or in a slow process of decline. And now we know that that's just not the case. Like pretty much everything else I found while researching Are We Done Fighting? What I've just shared about our influence over each other and our malleability is neither all good nor all bad, but a mix. A study found that people on university campuses were significantly more likely to donate when the pitch included 4 simple words at the end. Any guesses what the words were? I'm a student too. We have sympathy for people who are like us. Feeling like we're part of a group is really, really important. Groups provide us with safety, with a sense of belonging, with meaning in our lives. They provide us with people we can learn from, share with, and trust. But that can also lead to catastrophic consequences when we feel like others aren't part of our group. That's the process called othering. And it doesn't depend on any particular characteristic of the other. I want to make that point. So for instance, if you randomly divide up workers in a workplace into 2 groups, you can readily have workers in one group start feeling negatively about workers in another group who are of their same race, and start feeling more positively about workers in their same group who are of a different race. So race, a category that we've learned since birth, is suddenly less powerful than other group member, a randomly created category 30 seconds ago. A takeaway from that is that how we frame the issues, how we set up and think about situations, can polarize them or can help our thinking remain more creative and constructive. Research into children is suggesting that othering can start very young. Even preschoolers think it's less immoral to harm members of another group than to harm members of their own group. However, children with overtly racist parents don't seem to pick up on the idea that race defines something about a child's character until around age 6. And that's an area of ongoing study, and there's much more about that in the book. The book also has a lot more information about this topic of othering in general, but I want to touch on a few of the specific findings that I think are really interesting for this. One topic that's become a major election question in a lot of countries recently, and certainly here in Canada, has been about migrants and refugees. Studies have looked at the characteristics of folks who are more open to accepting refugees into their countries. And these are people who tend to show fewer physical signs of distress when they're presented with situations of uncertainty. They're also less disgusted just in general. So for example, a picture of an unflushed toilet won't cause them to sweat or to tense up as much. However, studies have also found that making these people feel afraid in the lab will temporarily shift their views, so they start showing less acceptance of refugees. It's also been found that experiencing a real-life trauma outside of the lab can have the same effect. And the opposite has also been found, which is really interesting. So in the lab, getting people to imagine they have a superpower that makes them invulnerable to harm means that they temporarily say, yeah, I'm okay with refugees, that's fine. I think this tells us a few interesting things. Many studies are suggesting that perception of others as threats to us and the feeling of disgust, that is, that we could get sick and should stay away from what could make us sick, is something that we're anciently attuned to, and some of us more than others. We may be prone to feeling threatened and disgusted by people who actually don't pose any threat to our health or well-being. Or we may not be threatened enough, and that could be dangerous too. So for example, we might be too open to accepting new technologies where conserving tradition and thinking about the risks would have been more beneficial to us. So ideally, this research is giving us a bit more cause for understanding those whose views are different from our own and seeing some value in considering their views, at least up to a point. It could be that they have a perspective that we haven't thought of and that's important. Here's another related example. So you're asked this question: how moral is it to lie on your resume? All of us know that we make careful choices, so we're going to answer this question consistently, right? But that's not what happens. We consider this question to be the answer. We think it's much less moral, much more immoral, if we're asked the question in a room full of smelly garbage. Garbage should have nothing to do with our moral compass, but it does, right? And this is part of a body of research on embodied cognition, how what we're experiencing in the body is very much connected to the decisions we make and what we say and how we think. So a big takeaway from this is that if you're in a conflict, try to control the environment as much as possible. Try to have it in a positive setting. So this is one of the reasons why Quakers at the international level at the UN will try to have people meeting in an informal context in a really nice kind of a home environment. And they'll make sure that no one uses titles. So they're just speaking to each other as people, and they'll share a meal together. And that's a very different environment from the UN environment where there's a lot of hierarchy and a lot of stress. And you can really have a different conversation, a different process for working something through in an environment like that. So to recap what I've said so far, all of us are malleable and continually changing. Situations affect our choices a lot more than we like to think. And perceived safety or threat are important in many polarizing situations today. This was really fascinating to me. It actually turns out that a lot of times when we are feeling less confident about something, we are more aggressive in defending that idea to others. So what's going on there? A lot of it seems to be about our identity. It's important to feel like we're part of that group, right? Even in a very specific fringe online community today, like adult men who love My Little Pony, which is a real online thing. We want to be part of our group, whatever the group is. And it can be very costly, very stressful, and very uncertain to be on the margins and pushed out from the safety of our group. So it seems that most of us are actually much more concerned about feeling that our beliefs will keep us in good standing with our group than we are in being honest or consistent in our behavior. Famous studies have shown that a lot of people will go along with decisions that they know are wrong as long as everyone else seems to be unanimous. There's good evidence that that's happening right now in all kinds of workplaces, and this has been studied with teachers, it's been studied with prison guards, it's been studied with prisoners. There are all kinds of cultures where people know that they're not benefiting from the status quo. They know that the decision that they are supporting is bad for them, and they still go along with it. But if we are helped to realize that not everyone is in agreement, that can actually very much change this dynamic. So a recommendation from the book, and there are many others on this topic of groups, is that if you're working with a group where you think people have more or less the same views, before the meeting starts, have the person who's facilitating that meeting assign someone the role of devil's advocate. That way they are forced to try to poke holes in the ideas from others in the group, and no one thinks that they're doing it just because they're being mean. They're doing it because that's their role in the meeting. And you have that role rotating, so everyone else knows I wasn't devil's advocate this time, but I have to be nice to the devil's advocate because I'm going to have to do it in the future. Stereotypes certainly aren't always good, but they aren't always bad either. Neuroscientists have found that your brain isn't just passively sitting there and reacting to the outside world. Instead, it shows continual waves of intrinsic activity. What it's actually doing appears to be constantly simulating and making predictions. So you're predicting right now what my next word is going to be, and then based on data coming into your ear, you're adjusting that prediction. So all of us are using internal expectations, stereotypes, all the time to help us know what we're experiencing and to navigate through life. We seem to be hardwired for that. We're able to, in the blink of an eye, tell that a bird is a bird, even though we've never seen that exact bird, and we may have never even seen that species. But what happens when this is applied to people? Well, it's usually possible to find people who seem to conform to the stereotypes. In the case of the picture here, it's attention grabbing in part because it doesn't conform to our stereotypes about white male police officers. Okay, so now we're in a tough conversation. How many people here think that to change your mind on an issue like the death penalty, the person that you're talking to would have to present you with really clear evidence? The research that I did overwhelmingly disconfirmed that idea, unfortunately. It's not that evidence never changes our mind, but the general trend is that it is unlikely to on issues that are very close to our identity. So an issue like the death penalty for a lot of people where they care about it deeply and I care about my belief on it deeply. So when we're presented with that kind of information, we're likely to show brain activity associated with rumination and with reflection on who we are as people. And those of us who show the most of this kind of threatened and ruminating response are also the most likely to hold fast to our current beliefs in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence. As researcher Jonas Kaplan puts it, when we feel threatened, anxious, or emotional, then we are less likely to change our minds. And that may sound obvious, but we regularly ignore this when we're trying to change people's minds. Piles of evidence that I found all suggested that information, especially when it's presented in an aggressive debate format, is not that useful. In fact, and this was really interesting to me, folks on the left and on the right were doing very similar things when they got information that they didn't like. So here's a recent study that was published after the book came out even, and it was looking at two groups of people on the left. So they were randomly divided into two groups, and group A was shown the data, and they were told this data is from a study that found that white men performed significantly better than black women on all of these types of workplace tasks. That group said this study is garbage. They poked all kinds of holes in it. They looked at it. They said this should be rejected completely. The exact same data was presented to the second group, and they were told this study found that black women performed significantly better than white men on all of these types of tasks. That group said this study is rock solid. It's really important, and anybody who rejects it is just being racist. So when we're presented with information, a lot of times what we do is try to poke holes in what we don't want to believe, and we don't put that level of effort into trying to poke holes in what we do want to believe. So what works? Well, one study tested hundreds of different options showing all of these video clips from this rant by comedian John Oliver explaining why equating Islam and terrorism is so irrational and harmful. I thought the rant was factually accurate and pretty funny. It did absolutely nothing to change anyone's mind. And yes, information matters, but it's not enough. So what works? The study did find one strategy that worked. It's actually useful not just for addressing Islamophobia, but for any inaccurate view whatsoever. And it's a tip that anyone here can use. You can even use it on yourself. But I want to pause first and tell a story to help explain this finding better. This is Megan Phelps Roper. She grew up in a hateful family. From the age of 5, she was holding signs saying, "God hates Jews" and "God hates gay people." She had a complete turnaround and gave up her hateful life, which meant that she had to accept being shunned by her family, cast out of the safety of her group, and had to completely change her identity. How did that painful transformation happen? It was Twitter. It's true. It's true. A lot of people on the platform were really aggressive with her, obviously. But there were some others who reached out and were genuinely curious. They were trying to find out, why did she believe so passionately what she did? And they spent years in conversation, and it turned from something, just a casual back and forth to more of a bond and a friendship. And over time, she started to see that these people weren't the monsters that she'd been led to believe. In reflecting back on her prior life, Megan explained that anyone who insulted her was easy to reject because she knew she was a righteous outsider fighting for what was good and moral and what other people couldn't see. In other words, she knew that her group's intentions were always good and that they were right. They knew they were harming people, of course they did, but they believed that it was necessary for their noble cause. And that's an absolutely key point, and one that I hope everyone will take away and recall whenever you're in any type of argument whatsoever. We all believe we're fighting for the right cause. We think what we're doing is good. When Megan engaged with people who had views different from her own, she was forced to realize that they weren't evil, and therefore she wasn't purely good. Everything was messier and more complicated than she'd ever imagined. So I want to make sure that this isn't just a thing on the right. On the left, I found folks who were doing engaged in very similar simplistic and aggressive othering, and really engaged in ways that seemed to be tearing their group members apart. Really scary stories of people's lives being destroyed by this type of activism. So this is the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia University, and it's apparently a small lab in a basement there. And what they do is they survey people, they find people with really strong views on topics, and then they bring those people together to have a conversation. So one of the participants might have a strong support for abortion, and the other might be strongly opposed to abortion. And they have to sit down face to face, have a 1-hour conversation about abortion. So a lot of these conversations go really poorly. That's one finding that isn't that surprising. But the more surprising finding is that some of them actually go quite well. And what's the difference? It seems to be that the folks who are having a better conversation are having a more complex conversation. So they're not just agreeing with the other side, but they're feeling challenged, but they're also feeling some genuine warmth. And they're feeling a whole range of other things as well. So it's not important to have a better disagreement that you agree with the other party. It's actually more important that you have a rich, complex conversation. And a lot of this is about breaking out of the binary tunnel vision that says, I'm right, they're wrong. I'm the one, that's the zero. And so the great thing that I found in this research is that that type of complex thinking can be taught. We can learn it. And apparently programs are even having success in teaching that to former violent extremists. There's more about that in the book. So here's a question. Why do people who care more about fairness cheat more on tests? That's a real finding. Recall that we all think that we're fighting for the right cause, right? If I particularly care about fairness, I can tell myself a story that says, I deserve to cheat because this test is inappropriate some way, because I didn't sleep that well last night, so usually I'd get a better mark, so I can get away with a few extra questions. How much I cheat depends on how good that story is, because I want to feel that I'm a good person, that I'm fighting for the right cause, and I want to get away with cheating on that test. So this story that I tell myself is how I help to balance these two completely different ideas, right? So that's rationalization. This has actually been studied in China, Turkey, Italy, Canada, the US, and they found really, really remarkably similar patterns. So almost no one cheated as much as they could possibly get away with. And almost everyone cheated at least a little bit. So that's the importance of that story, where if I cheat as much as I can possibly get away with, then I just am going to feel bad that I'm just a cheater. But if I can tell myself a story that says the test wasn't really fair, then I can get away with cheating that little bit, and then I can still feel good that I'm not just a bad person who cheats on things. So the point is, it turns out that a lot of our really bad behavior isn't because we're evil, but because we're really skilled at rationalizing and thinking that we're good. And I found this in research into psychology of torturers, mass murderers, all kinds of folks who think that somehow what they're doing is the right thing to be doing and a good thing. So what I'm doing is fair because I'm a victim, because other people do it too, because that person deserves it. Again, it might not be an actually good story objectively, but as long as it's good enough for me to believe that I'm a good person and to keep doing what I'm doing, that's what matters. You may be thinking that the biases that we're discussing here explain other people's behaviors, but that you're too clever for it. I know that's tempting. I like to think that too, but unfortunately, that's not what I found in the research either. So people with more formal education actually show more of these types of biases, not fewer. And a lot of that seems to be because they have more material to draw from. If you've read a lot of stuff, then you can quote Nietzsche and use him to explain whatever bad behavior you want to engage in. The more certain that we are that we're being moral, the more firmly convinced, the more that we're able to rationalize harming others who oppose us. Researchers have called that one the dark side of moral conviction. I think we all need to take careful note of it, because whatever our political views are, a lot of us are very certain about them. A lot more so than we probably can be justified in being, objectively speaking. And that can get very dangerous. So what works? Remember that I said that there was a result from this study that had tested a whole bunch of different videos, and it was useful in toning down Islamophobic views. Well, it turns out that the fuel of the rationalization that we've just been talking about is ambiguity. So get people to publicly commit to an answer. Get them to specify the values, to define what fair is. Get them to define the rules of the game. So here's how the researchers did this. They had participants in the study answer questions like, on June 17th, 2015, Dylan Roof entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church and during a prayer service killed 9 African American parishioners. Roof cited his white identity as a motivation for the attacks. How responsible do you think you are for the acts of Dylan Roof? How responsible do you think white Americans are for the acts of Dylan Roof? After answering that question, participants were asked questions like this. Muniba is a Muslim who owns a small bakery in southern France. How responsible do you think Muniba is for the Paris attacks, referring to a bombing that had just been carried out by Daesh in Paris? When answering questions to remove the ambiguity, to define the rules of the game, of when can someone be blamed for the acts of their entire group and when can't they, people were 50% less inclined to blame all Muslims for the acts of Daesh. And people were much less likely to sign an Islamophobic petition. And this study was carried out in Barcelona, And during the course of the study, there was a bombing by Daesh in Barcelona. So these findings were holding 3 months later, even though there had been a bombing in that 3-month period. So I think that's an important one to keep in mind. Asking questions to help people see inconsistencies in their beliefs is regularly, although maybe not always, but regularly a lot more effective than giving information. How can I win, or how can I prove this person wrong, turns into how can I bring out this person's best self? That's a very different dynamic for the next disagreement that you're in. So you're thinking about strategically drawing on and speaking to this person's values and getting them in the situation where their best self can come out, and asking them the questions to help that happen. Taking that logic to the streets to interrupt white supremacist rallies, I found cases of people, for instance, dressing up like clowns and throwing a party rather than starting a fight. The idea here was to disrupt the wave of hate that was spreading and to powerfully spread humor and joy instead, not just to mock or belittle the white supremacists. If it's being done well, the idea is to really build a sense of joy and try to spread that. And I want to say that this is covered a lot more in the book, but none of this is perfect by any means. It's not a total fix. And I found a lot of stories of people who were drastically changed, but it takes a significant amount of time and effort. Unfortunately, I didn't find any 5 minutes to end hate. There's just one more study that I'm going to touch on. And it's a scientifically tested technique that I think is really useful, and I've started using, and I never would have thought of it. So I like sharing it with people. So folks were asked all kinds of questions like, do you support sanctions on Iran? And people from the left and from the right tended to have pretty convinced, strong views about these topics. So most of us at this point would think to ask the question, why? Right? We'd say, well, why do you believe that? Tell me your reasons. This study looked at that, and asking the people why did absolutely nothing to change their beliefs. But then they found another approach that actually yielded immediate results. How? Can you explain how that would work? What happened was people were asked the mechanisms, and they heard themselves faltering out loud. It turns out that most of us don't know that much about international sanctions. They're very complicated. When we're asked that cause and effect mechanism and we can't explain it, we then greatly tone down our initial certainty. Now there's a caveat to this research which is important. If we don't know the details of how something works, we might just say, it doesn't matter. It's just, I don't care how sanctions work, they're just always evil. When we're doing that, what we're doing is we're kicking the question back into the moral domain. We're allowing ourselves that ambiguity where we don't have to define the rules of the game and where we can rationalize whatever we want to believe. So in order to get away from that, you can say, okay, I hear you saying that sanctions are evil, and I understand that, but can you explain how they work? So you're trying to come back to the cause-effect mechanism at play. I'm just curious, how are people impacted by sanctions? How many people? When do sanctions happen, etc.? The ideal for the book is that it starts to spark a conversation with people, and to try to make that as easy as possible. I've done it in a very conversational, straightforward tone, so it's not going to be academic or difficult to read, hopefully. I've done it with short chapters, so you can get through the chapter easily. At the end of each chapter, it has bullet points of the kind of key takeaways and tips that you can learn and use right away. And then it has exercises. And the exercises is really, my hope is that people will find this useful as a study guide that they can do together. And I think it should be complementary for lots of existing issues. So, you know, if folks want to work on environmental issues and they want to try to change environmental policy, then they can use some of the tips here, and it should be able to complement what they're already doing and help them they want to work on gender issues, if they want to work on whatever it is. So I hope that it will be used in study groups because it's one thing to learn by reading, but like learning by experiencing and by role playing and by really practicing this stuff and having those conversations can be a lot richer, right? It's that connection thing again. Like, I think this is a great tool for having deeper conversations and connection with people, and I've experienced that in the study group that I've been using it with in Toronto.